In the past 30 days, insurance premiums for vessels entering the Strait of Hormuz have quietly spiked by more than several tankers slowed, rerouted, or paused outside the choke point. No formal blockade was declared. No fleet closed the passage. Yet the flow of oil hesitated. That hesitation did not begin with missiles. It began with risk calculations written into shipping contracts and underwriters' spreadsheets. The world focused on the rhetoric, the system moved on pricing, and in that narrow space between perception and cost, something far more consequential began to take shape. A supply chain that had been treated as resilient revealed a subtle form of fragility. Not because it broke, because it hesitated at exactly the point where delay is as powerful as disruption. This is the kind of change that rarely announces itself. It accumulates in small decisions. A captain choosing to wait, an insurer raising a premium, a buyer seeking an alternative cargo, each decision rational on its own. Together, they begin to redraw the map of energy movement. And once that map begins to shift, it does not easily return to its previous form. What you are watching is not a closure. It is a recalibration. And recalibrations, when they occur at the level of global energy flows, rarely remain contained to one region or one country. They propagate outward through prices, through alliances, through strategic assumptions that suddenly no longer hold. The strait remains open. That is the surface reality. But the system that depends on it has already begun to behave differently. And that difference is where the real story begins. Do you believe a strait can remain open and still fundamentally disrupt global power dynamics? Or has something already shifted beyond what maps can show? I am Liang. I spend my time reading the documents most people never see, tracking the movements others summarize, and following the incentives that shape state behavior. If this kind of analysis reaches you, you already understand its rarity. Subscribing is simply the mechanism that allows it to continue. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil consumption moves through the Strait of Hormuz, according to estimates from the International Energy Agency. Around 20 million barrels per day pass through a corridor at its narrowest point just 21 miles wide. These are not abstract figures. They represent the daily energy intake of entire industrial economies. When movement through this passage slows, even marginally, the effect is not linear. It compounds, freight costs rise, insurance premiums follow. Refiners adjust procurement schedules. Futures markets react to perceived risk rather than physical shortage. The result is a system that begins to price in instability before instability fully materializes. In 2019, attacks on tankers near the strait briefly drove insurance rates sharply higher and forced shipping companies to reconsider routing strategies. That episode did not close the strait. It changed behavior. And behavior, in a system this large, is often more consequential than any single event. Today, the signals are quieter but structurally similar. Maritime risk assessments are tightening. Regional tensions are being translated into cost structures. Buyers are watching closely. Sellers are adjusting quietly. The visible narrative remains centered on political statements and military posturing. The underlying system is already adapting. That adaptation matters now because it is occurring at a moment when global energy demand remains high and spare capacity is limited. It matters because the countries most dependent on these flows have built their long-term strategies on the assumption that the strait, while vulnerable, would remain functionally reliable. And it matters because once alternative patterns of trade begin to form, they tend to persist even after the immediate trigger fades. This is not about a temporary disruption. It is about the possibility that the baseline assumption of stability in one of the world's most important energy corridors is being quietly revised. The first layer of this situation is physical movement. The second is financial cost. The third is strategic dependency. And it is at that third layer that the implications become far more significant than the initial signal suggests. China's energy strategy over the past 2 decades has been built on diversification, but not on detachment. The country remains the world's largest importer of crude oil, bringing in more than 10 million barrels per day, according to data from the International Energy Agency. A significant portion of that supply originates in the Gulf region and transits through Hormuz. On paper, diversification exists. Pipelines from Russia, overland routes from Central Asia, maritime flows from Africa and Latin America. In practice, the Gulf remains central. The volumes are too large, the infrastructure too entrenched, the pricing too competitive. This creates a structural condition that is often misunderstood. China is not dependent on a single supplier. It is dependent on a system, and that system has a geographic choke point embedded within it. When that choke point begins to exhibit even minor instability, the impact is not immediate shortage. It is recalculation. Chinese refiners begin to hedge, state planners reassess risk exposure. Strategic reserves, which China has spent years building, become part of the equation rather than a distant contingency. The surface narrative suggests resilience. And there is resilience. But resilience has a cost. Drawing on reserves, shifting supply chains, paying higher premiums. These are not signs of collapse. They are signs of strain. And strain, sustained over time, alters strategic behavior. There is also a diplomatic layer embedded within this dynamic. China's relationship with Iran has been framed as a long-term partnership, formalized in part through the 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021. That agreement outlined potential investments in energy, infrastructure, and security cooperation. It was interpreted by many as a strategic alignment that would secure China's access to Iranian resources while providing Tehran with economic relief. On paper, the logic remains intact, but the practical execution of that partnership depends on the same maritime routes now exhibiting instability. If Iranian oil cannot move predictably through Hormuz, the value of that partnership shifts, not in rhetoric but in logistics. And logistics in energy markets is everything. The contradiction becomes clear. China's effort to secure long-term supply through partnership intersects with a geographic vulnerability that partnership alone cannot mitigate. At the same time, the United States maintains a significant naval presence in the region, explicitly tasked with ensuring freedom of navigation. This creates a layered deterrence structure. Iran has the capacity to disrupt. The United States has the capacity to respond. Neither side benefits from full escalation. Yet both operate within a space where limited actions can generate disproportionate economic effects. This creates a condition of controlled instability. The strait remains open. The risk remains elevated. The system continues to function, but it does so under a different set of assumptions than it did before. And that shift in assumptions is where the deeper strategic consequences begin to emerge. The second layer is not about ships or missiles. It is about pricing power and who absorbs risk when uncertainty enters the system. Oil did not stop moving through the strait, but the cost of moving it began to change. That change is where the real shift begins. Freight rates on key Gulf routes have shown volatility tied directly to perceived risk, not physical disruption. Insurance premiums have followed a similar pattern, adjusting upward when tensions rise, then stabilizing without fully returning to previous levels. This creates a ratchet effect. Each episode leaves the baseline slightly higher than before. At the surface, this looks like a temporary market reaction. Traders hedge, insurers adjust, buyers accept higher costs. But one layer deeper, the pattern reveals something more structural. Energy markets are not simply reacting to events. They are repricing geography. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer treated as a stable corridor with occasional disruption risk. It is increasingly priced as a persistent uncertainty. That distinction matters, because persistent uncertainty changes long-term contracts, investment decisions, and supply chain design. Consider the behavior of major Asian importers. Japan and South Korea, both heavily dependent on Gulf crude, have historically accepted Hormuz risk as manageable within a broader security framework anchored by the United States. Now, even without closure, there are quiet discussions about diversification. Not immediate replacement. That is not feasible at scale, but incremental shifts. More cargoes from the United States, increased interest in West African grades, long-term LNG contracts that reduce oil exposure. Each move small, each move rational. Together they begin to dilute the centrality of one route, and this is where a perspective often overlooked becomes essential. The view from India? India is the world's third largest oil importer, with consumption exceeding 5 million barrels per day, according to data from the International Energy Agency. A significant share of that supply also moves through Hormuz. Yet, India's response is not framed in the same strategic language as China's. It is more transactional, more flexible. Indian refiners have shown a willingness to shift sourcing rapidly based on price and risk. When sanctions limited Iranian exports in the past, India adjusted. When discounted Russian crude became available after 2022, India increased purchases significantly. The system is designed to adapt. That flexibility changes the picture because it reveals that not all major importers experience Hormuz risk in the same way. China's model emphasizes long-term strategic alignment and infrastructure investment. India's model emphasizes opportunistic diversification and price sensitivity. When risk rises in the strait, China's exposure is embedded in its partnerships and supply chains. India's exposure is mediated through its ability to switch. This does not eliminate risk. It redistributes it. Now take one more step deeper. If persistent uncertainty in Hormuz leads to gradual diversification among major buyers, the bargaining power of Gulf producers begins to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, but perceptibly. If buyers perceive alternative routes and sources as increasingly necessary, producers face a different competitive environment. Discounts may become more common, contract terms may become more flexible. The pricing structure that has historically favored stable, predictable Gulf exports begins to loosen. At the same time, China's strategic investments in Iran become harder to operationalize at scale, not because the partnership dissolves, but because the logistics that underpin it are less predictable. Infrastructure on land cannot fully compensate for instability at sea. Pipelines cannot replace the volume capacity of maritime transport at current levels. The contradiction sharpens. China has invested to secure supply. The route that carries that supply is becoming less stable in economic terms, even if it remains physically open. And this leads to a deeper consequence that is rarely stated directly. The center of gravity in global energy trade may begin to shift not because of a single crisis, but because of accumulated adjustments to risk. When enough actors begin to behave differently, the system itself changes. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to close for its influence to diminish. It only needs to become less reliable in the eyes of those who depend on it. This is the surface reading of the economic layer. The deeper reading is that risk is no longer episodic. It is being internalized into the structure of global energy pricing, and once risk becomes structural, it begins to reshape strategy across multiple actors simultaneously. There is, however, a layer beneath even this, one that does not appear in shipping data or pricing charts. It appears in timelines. What most observers miss is that infrastructure decisions made today are not responses to current conditions. They are bets on future stability. Pipelines, ports, refineries, these are investments measured in decades. And once built, they lock in patterns of behavior that are difficult to reverse. China's Belt and Road Initiative, including its energy corridors, was designed with this in mind. Diversification through overland routes, reduced reliance on maritime choke points, strategic depth. Yet the reality is more complex. Overland routes from Central Asia and Russia cannot fully substitute for Gulf volumes at current demand levels. They complement, they do not replace, and they introduce their own vulnerabilities. Political risk, infrastructure limitations, capacity constraints. The system remains interdependent. Now consider what happens if the current pattern continues. Not escalation, not closure, persistent uncertainty. Insurance premiums that remain elevated, freight rates that fluctuate unpredictably, buyers gradually diversifying, producers adjusting terms, infrastructure investments recalibrated to account for risk. In 2 years, the changes are subtle. A few percentage points shift in sourcing. Slightly higher baseline costs. In 5 years, the shifts become visible. New supply routes gain market share. Strategic reserves are used more actively as buffers. In 10 years, the map of global energy flows may look different. Not unrecognizable, but altered in ways that reflect a decade of adaptation to uncertainty. This creates a strategic dilemma for China. Continue investing in partnerships that depend on a route becoming less predictable, or accelerate diversification into alternatives that cannot fully match volume or cost. Neither option is clean. Both carry trade-offs. For the United States, the dilemma is different. Maintain security guarantees in the region at significant cost, or accept a gradual diffusion of influence as markets adapt independently. For Gulf producers, the dilemma is whether to compete more aggressively on price or risk losing incremental market share over time. And beneath all of this lies a question that is rarely asked directly. What does stability mean in a system that continues to function while behaving differently? Because if stability is defined by uninterrupted flow, the strait remains stable. If stability is defined by predictable cost and behavior, that stability is already eroding. There is one more layer still, and it does not sit in markets or infrastructure. It sits in domestic calculations that shape how states respond to external pressure. Inside Iran, the strategic use of controlled tension has long been part of statecraft, actions calibrated to signal capability without triggering full-scale confrontation. This is not improvisation. It is doctrine shaped by decades of asymmetric engagement. The objective is not closure of the strait, That would invite overwhelming response. The objective is influence, to remind external actors that risk cannot be eliminated, only managed. At the surface, this appears as a series of incidents: harassment of vessels, seizures, demonstrations of capability, each event limited, each event deniable to a degree. But one layer deeper, the pattern reveals a consistent logic. Increase perceived risk just enough to shift behavior, without crossing the threshold that triggers direct confrontation. This is where the domestic dimension intersects with the external system. Iran's leadership operates within a political environment where demonstrating resilience against external pressure carries internal legitimacy. At the same time, economic constraints, including sanctions and inflation, limit the capacity for sustained escalation. The result is a calibrated approach: pressure without closure, signal without collapse. And this creates an interaction with global markets that is both subtle and powerful, because markets do not require certainty of disruption. They respond to probability. If the probability of disruption increases even slightly, pricing adjusts. Behavior changes. The system adapts. Now consider the feedback loop. Iran signals capability. Markets respond by pricing in risk. Buyers diversify slightly. That diversification reduces long-term dependence. Reduced dependence weakens the leverage that signaling was designed to create. To compensate, signaling may increase. The cycle continues. This is not a stable equilibrium. It is a dynamic one. And dynamic systems, when left to evolve without clear resolution, tend to move toward new configurations rather than returning to previous states. Which brings us to a final, often overlooked actor in this equation: the insurance market itself. Firms based largely in London and other financial centers determine risk premiums that directly influence shipping behavior. Their assessments are not political statements. They are financial judgments based on perceived risk. Yet those judgments have geopolitical consequences. When premiums rise, routes change. When routes change, trade patterns shift. When trade patterns shift, strategic relationships evolve. In 2023 and 2024, war risk premiums in the region demonstrated how quickly financial actors can alter the economics of shipping. This is not a marginal effect. It is a lever, and it operates outside traditional state control. So when we speak about instability in Hormuz, we are not only speaking about ships and states. We are speaking about a network of actors whose decisions collectively shape outcomes: governments, companies, insurers, traders, each responding to incentives, each adjusting behavior, none fully controlling the system. And it is precisely this distributed nature of decision-making that makes the current situation so difficult to reverse. There is no single action that restores previous assumptions. There is only the accumulation of new ones. If this kind of analysis is reaching you, understand what that implies. It means you are seeing the structure beneath the headlines. That visibility does not spread on its own. It moves because individuals choose to pass it on. Subscribing and sharing is how this work continues and reaches others who need to see what is actually happening. So what does all of this actually tell us? It tells us that the strait remains open while behaving like a constraint. Around 20 million barrels per day still pass through Hormuz, yet pricing now treats that flow as conditional rather than assured. It tells us that risk has moved from events into structure. Insurance premiums rise without closure, and those increases alter behavior before any disruption occurs. It tells us that China's position is not defined by access alone, but by the reliability of the route that sustains that access. The 2021 long-term cooperation framework with Iran promised continuity of supply, yet that promise depends on a corridor now priced for uncertainty. It tells us that different import models produce different vulnerabilities. India's flexible sourcing absorbs shocks through substitution, while China's embedded partnerships concentrate exposure within a single system. It tells us that financial actors, not only states, are shaping outcomes. Underwriters in London adjust premiums, and those adjustments redirect tankers and reprice contracts across continents. It tells us that Iran's calibrated signaling is effective not because it closes the strait, but because it raises the probability of disruption just enough to change decisions elsewhere. And it tells us that once these adjustments accumulate, they begin to redraw the map without any formal announcement of change. What emerges is not a crisis in the traditional sense, but a slow transformation of assumptions that underpinned global energy trade for decades. The strait is still there. The ships are still moving, but the system surrounding them is no longer the same system that existed before these signals began. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence points to a narrow set of indicators that will determine how this develops. Watch the behavior of war risk premiums for Gulf transit. If they remain elevated even during periods of reduced tension, the shift from episodic to structural risk is confirmed. Watch Chinese import patterns. Any sustained increase in non-Gulf sourcing, even by a few percentage points, signals strategic recalibration rather than temporary adjustment. Watch India's purchasing behavior as a counterpoint. Continued flexibility will highlight the divergence between embedded and adaptive systems. There is also a military dimension that cannot be ignored. The posture of United States naval forces in the region, particularly escort operations and rules of engagement, will shape the boundary between deterrence and escalation. None of these indicators alone determines the outcome. Together, they form a pattern. That pattern will reveal whether the current condition stabilizes into a new equilibrium or continues to evolve into something less predictable. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The perspectives presented here are based on publicly available information and represent an independent analytical interpretation of that information. No claim is made regarding privileged access or classified sources. The voiceover used in this video is generated using artificial intelligence technology. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple credible sources, examine primary data where possible, and form their own conclusions based on a broad and balanced understanding of the subject. Understanding how power actually moves is not an abstract exercise. It shapes the prices you pay, the stability of the systems you rely on, and the future your children inherit. Most people will never see these dynamics because they are not presented clearly. That leaves a choice: to accept the surface narrative or to look beneath it. If you know someone who pays attention to global events but has not seen this layer, send this to them directly. One person, that is how clarity spreads. Every comment, every share, every subscription is not a signal of approval. It is a mechanism that allows analysis like this to reach further than it otherwise would. Leave one comment with your reading of where this goes next, or the country you are watching most closely right now. The next shift is already forming, and when it appears, it will not be where most people are looking. I am Professor Liang. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.